People I talked to about 100 essential workers in a million different industries. And their main concern was that the public applause and adulation and respect was never translating into some really material benefit. And so they felt both happy that for once, like essential workers had always been there. They were always around. They're still around. We just gave them a new name for a couple of years. And during that time, a lot of them were proud of that, adage or that name. But, really there was a moment of cognitive dissonance when it did not really amount to any sort of real significant transformation in their lives.
Well, they were called heroes and then they were left to die.
Yeah,
That was the reality.
yeah, exactly. So the hero worship thing was pretty interesting. The book starts in New York, where I talked to nurses who were walking into their hospital while applause is happening, knowing full well that, like, the members of the public, the government is not doing what it has to do to keep cases down. And there's a real tension there between that sort of respect and that, on the one hand, then or sort of celebrity status, but then lack of real respect. Heroes, superheroes by definition, don't need protections. They don't need government programs to help them out. They don't need a better boss. They definitely don't need a union. They just rise above the fray, right? And so in naming people heroes, I think we sort of undermined the necessity to really do right by them.
Right. And I mean, that is what I have particular allergy to performative actions, but that I think is what stuck in my craw most of all about the applause. I mean, I'm here in New York, and I couldn't really put my finger on why it bothered me so much. But
Yeah.
I like what you also discussed was and it the expansion of the classification of essential workers as well, right? Which is that yes, you spoke to those nurses, people who experience the front lines there, but there were also people on the front lines who were deemed essential workers, and there was no real reason for it, like Walmart greeters you talk about. Um,
Right.
yeah,
Yeah. So who amounted to an essential worker was very capricious, and it changed city to city, town to town, state to state, you know, neighborhood to neighborhood at times. So one chapter starts off with a woman who was a Walmart greeter and who was deemed essential during the pandemic. She passed away, so I interviewed her mother. And a lot of people began to ask, well, why is it important that someone says, welcome to Walmart every time you enter in the middle of the largest health crisis in a century? There were other people like, elite fly fishing guides in Montana were deemed essential because they're essential to the tourist economy in the summer of that state. And so there was a lot of, politicking and lobbying behind the scenes to get one's business either considered essential or not. The other thing is that some workers were deemed essential in some jobs while they were working in the front lines, but not in others. So I interviewed people who worked in fast food jobs who are they're just like the lowest rung of the employment spectrum in America. Yet when they worked on the same day, their next shift was as a nursing aide. People were like, "Oh my God, you're an essential hero," right? Yeah, they were working at the same time, and so I think that speaks to the kind of subjective nature of what that designation really was.
I mean, within this classification of essential worker, there's such a broad range of workers as you discuss, like those examples that you gave, and they're being put unnecessarily in harm's way because they are essential to capitalism, kind of like continuing to function at a certain level of profitability or viability for people at the top. And then there's essential workers working deemed heroes in hospitals and healthcare facilities, and they are, but that what they receive is recognition as a replacement for compensation. I mean, and that's the story of workers in the pandemic, or part of it, of course.
That's part of the story. Yeah, we need a new definition of what workplace heroism looks like, I think, because people did and do perform heroic acts that saved people's lives. Not all of it was just showing up day after day at your drudgery job. Like, we needed nurses on picket lines. We needed home care aides at the bargaining table. We needed teachers in the streets demanding that their families were priorities for vaccines. Like, they performed all these heroic acts that are largely considered disruptive to the status quo that really actually mattered quite a bit. And I think that kind of heroism has largely been forgotten to a large extent.
Definitely. I mean, beside for the other essential workers like the Walmart greeters and the tour guides that you described, like, what's your sense of what the point of that was? Besides, one, keeping the economy going, but part of it to me feels like there's a labor discipline element to it as well, which is that we're not going to let you sit on your ass. You're going to expose yourself because this is what our society is built on. You are supposed to be coming to work, and certain people can stay home and work from home, but not your class of people.
Right, exactly. We prioritized the business culture of the largest employers. That's basically what some of essential work was, again, as you said, completely necessary. Some of it, we just prioritized the sort of social and cultural habits and norms of large employers. If Walmart needs someone to say that when you walk in, then we're going to have someone to do that, right? If, in food processing plants, if the line has to go that fast for some ungodly reason, the line will go that fast. There was a lot of no exceptions to the way a lot of low wage and dangerous work happened. And I think people are unaware of, we think of that all these workplaces had sneeze guards and blinders, and people built all these protections in, and people got increased unemployment insurance. And a lot of jobs had none of that. And they faced, their lives and their death down at work. And that's not heroism. That's like being sacrificed. And so I think, we should really, I hope that we've learned a little bit about the difference.
I hope so too. And there have been some encouraging signs in terms of worker solidarity that I do want to discuss with you at some later point in the interview. But you also talk about how the essential working class, disproportionately men and women of color, and how that played out alongside the Black Lives Matter movement and a wider reckoning about racism in the United States, systemic racism. And in many ways, that's an improvement in terms of the labor explosion of the 20th century, where it was very white in terms of like the dominant unions and the recognition that those workers got versus now. So there's a difference in terms of those things playing out alongside of each other. Can you talk about how those came together?
Yeah. So one of the most important parts of the pandemic, labor-wise, as you said, was the ability of workplace organizing and community organizing or political organizing to sort of cross-pollinate each other. So, many people including Chris Smalls from the Amazon Labor Union, were leaders in the essential worker movement, and are black, and are leaders in Black Lives Matter. And so that mattered a lot. And then the essential working class is just disproportionately Black and brown and female. And so the racism, the sort of systemic racism and the interpersonal racism that workers faced at work had natural spillover consequences for the Black Lives Matter movement. The other thing that's interesting there is that Black Lives Matter began to talk about, the strike for Black lives, and they began to really use the language of labor in a way that we hadn't seen before to some extent. And so the labor movement, began to be to some extent led by these undercurrents of workers who were really coming up from below. And again, many of whom were Black, and many of whom were female, many of whom were not even represented by labor unions. A third of the strikes in 2020 were led by workers without unions. That doesn't happen like in normal times. Like workers just don't walk off the job or sit in or strike without an organization. So it was a pretty anomalous situation, but I think some of that energy has carried over and has continued to, help build the Amazon movement, the Starbucks movement, some of the stuff happening in higher ed, stuff like that.
I mean, when they write about this time, right, beginning with JFK 8 and Chris Smalls, that was the spark of the pandemic and the open disregard for people's health and their lives. That just there was so much bubbling up, but that was really like a breaking point. And you talk about this in the book as in terms of like how workers can make gains when they create crises for capitalism. And it's almost kind of an inversion of the shock doctrine to a degree, where that usually when there's moments of crisis, that's when the military industrial complex or big corporations see opportunities, and there was a lot of that pandemic profiteering, real thing, and just look into those PPP loans as well. But there was some of this too, and that's encouraging.